People think the worst year of your life announces itself. Mine didn't. Mine arrived on a Tuesday in March, when a doctor used a word I already knew. 3 weeks later, the man holding 30 years of my savings used a word I had to look up. It meant the same thing. Gone. By July, I was 70. Alone in a house that used to hold a marriage, a gutted bank account, a pension that covered my medications and not much else. People ask me why the Philippines. They think it's the money, the weather, the beaches. It's not. The answer is longer than that and harder and more honest. And if you'll give me the time, I'd like to give it to you straight. But first, you need to know who I was before you can understand why I left.
My name is Joe. I spent 34 years as a high school history teacher in a mid-sized city in Ohio that I will not name because the people still there didn't do anything to deserve being in this story. I taught the same subject in the same building for 34 years. American history, European history, a single elective on the world wars that I ran every spring, and that became, over the decades, the class the kids actually wanted. I was not a famous teacher. I was not the one they made movies about. I was the one who showed up every single day and gave a damn about whether they understood that the past was not a dead thing, but a living pressure on everything they were going to do next. I married Sandra in 1979. She taught 4th grade. We met at a faculty development day that neither of us wanted to attend and bonded immediately over our shared contempt for the keynote speaker, who was telling a room of educators how to be more dynamic, in terms that suggested he had never actually met a child. She had dark eyes and a directness that felt like oxygen in a world full of people who talked around things. We were married 11 months later. Our daughter Claire was born in 1982, our son David in 1985. We built a life out of teacher salaries, which is to say we built it carefully, corner by corner, without any margin for error. And it was solid, because we made it solid. Because Sandra kept the books, and I did the repairs, and we both understood that money is a tool, and tools require respect. I want to tell you about Sandra, because she's the center of this story, even though she's not in it anymore. Even though the whole reason the story exists is that she isn't. Sandra was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday. Not in the calendar alert way. In the way where she'd been holding your birthday in her mind for 364 days waiting to deploy it. She had opinions about everything, and delivered them with a precision that sometimes made me defensive, and was always correct. She made the same chicken soup every winter from a recipe her mother gave her and her mother got from her mother, and the smell of it coming from the kitchen was the smell of being safe. She was diagnosed in January of our 69th year, pancreatic. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't come with a long act two. She lived 14 months from the word to the end, which the doctors told us was actually longer than average, as if that framing was supposed to be comfort, and which I have since decided to receive as the gift it actually was. 14 months. We used them. We used every week of them consciously, deliberately, the way you use things when you know the supply is finite, and you have finally stopped pretending it isn't. She died on a Thursday morning in February, in our bedroom, with the window cracked because she liked cold air even at the end, with Claire on one side and me on the other, and the soup recipe in a card in her handwriting on the nightstand, which she had written out and placed there sometime in the previous weeks without telling me, knowing I would need it and knowing I wouldn't ask. I found the card 3 days after the funeral. I sat on the kitchen floor and held it for about an hour. Now here is where I am supposed to tell you that I collected myself and began the process of healing. And I did, in the ways you do. I went through the motions of grief with what I thought was reasonable competence. The arrangements, the services, the thank you notes, the cleaning out of the closet that took me 4 attempts over 6 weeks. Claire called every day. David came for 2 weeks, and then had to go back to his life in Seattle, which is the right thing, the thing I told him to do, and also the thing that made the house so quiet when he left that I stood in the front hallway for 15 minutes, just registering the silence. But I was also, in those months, not looking carefully at my money. That is the part I find hardest to say out loud, because I am an organized man. I am a methodical man. I spent 34 years teaching young people to look critically at what they were told and examine the evidence and not accept the easy answer. And I handed a man I had known for 16 years complete authority over the thing Sandra and I had spent 4 decades building. And I did it because I was in grief, and grief does something to the part of your brain that runs the checks. His name is not important because he has lawyers, and I have a blog, and we will leave it at that. What he did is also not fully important for this story, except as context. What matters is the outcome, which was that approximately $240,000 of retirement savings, gone. Not all of it. The pension survived because it was separate and untouchable. The house survived because it was the house. But the savings that were supposed to turn a teacher's retirement from manageable into comfortable, the savings that were supposed to represent the second half of a life built in careful increments over 4 decades, those were gone. My lawyer used the word recovery. She said recovery was possible. She said the timeline was unclear. She said unclear with the expression of someone who means long and is being kind about it. I was 70 years old. I had a pension that covered my prescriptions and my utilities and my grocery bill if I was careful. I had a house I couldn't sell because I couldn't figure out what I would do without a mortgage to organize my finances around. I had a daughter in Boston and a son in Seattle, and neither of them was in a position to provide anything more than the love they were already providing in the regular calls and the worried eyes over video chat. I had a guest room that Sandra had used as her sewing room, and that I had not entered since the card on the nightstand. And I had winters in Ohio that, I want to say gently, are not engineered for a man who is grieving and alone and running a budget that has no softness in it. The idea of leaving came from David, which is funny because David was the one who was most worried about me leaving. He had sent me an article, the way adult children send you articles, as a kind of soft argument wrapped in the format of information sharing. It was about older Americans relocating abroad on fixed incomes. He sent it, I think, hoping I would read it and feel reassured that other people were doing something drastic, so I would feel less inclined to do something drastic. The reverse happened. I read it and felt the first thing I had felt since February that wasn't grief or anxiety. I felt interested. Interest is underrated as a life force. We talk about passion and purpose and all of those large words, but interest is the one that actually gets you out of bed. And I had not been genuinely interested in anything for 11 months, so I followed the interest. I started reading. I read for 2 months, and the country that kept appearing, the one that older people on fixed incomes kept describing in terms that seemed too good, but were independently verified by enough separate voices to start feeling like evidence, was the Philippines. Sandra would have had questions. Organized, systematic questions, delivered in the voice she used when she was being thorough rather than skeptical, which I had learned over 41 years was the voice that preceded her actually agreeing to things. She would have asked about healthcare, which was the right question. She would have asked about safety, also right. She would have asked about what I was planning to do with myself all day, in a place where I didn't know a soul, which is the question I didn't have a full answer to, and which, in her absence, I decided to treat as a reason to go find one. I picked Dumaguete. The reasons were straightforward. A university city, which meant English was common and the population skewed intellectual. A size that was manageable, not a megacity, not an isolated village. A seawall, where people walked in the evenings that showed up in every photograph with the same gentle constancy. And reports from multiple independent sources of a pace and a warmth that seemed like the specific antidote to what an Ohio winter and an empty house were doing to me. I gave myself a year's lease on the house, rented it to a young couple who needed the room and could afford what I needed to charge, packed 2 bags, and flew to Manila in October. I want to tell you what October in the Philippines feels like when you step off the plane from Ohio, because honest writing requires honoring the actual sequence of sensations. It feels like being absorbed. The heat doesn't hit you so much as it includes you, the way warm water includes a body. It smells of everything at once. Something sweet from a tree I couldn't see. Something fried from a cart I couldn't yet locate. Exhaust, salt, rain that had fallen recently and left the air still thick with its memory. The airport was noise and motion and announcements in 2 languages, and families greeting arrivals with the kind of expressiveness that feels theatrical until you understand it's simply the natural volume of people who feel things and show it. I got a domestic flight to Dumaguete, which from the air revealed itself slowly. A coastline, then a city, then a long gray seawall along the water, then the mountains rising behind everything green and absolute. I landed in the late afternoon. A man named Rodel was waiting with a handwritten sign that had my name spelled correctly, which I had learned from the forums to consider a good omen. Rodel drove for a small pension, which is what they call guest houses there, that a woman named Ate Cora ran on a street within walking distance of the boulevard. He was 50-ish, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who has ferried many confused foreigners from that airport and no longer finds confusion remarkable. He asked me if it was my first time. I said yes. He nodded, like I'd confirmed something. Then he said, "You will like it here. It is slow, but the slow is good." I didn't understand that yet. I would. Ate Cora was waiting at the gate. Ate means older sister in the way they use it, a term of respect, and she wore it naturally, the way some people wear authority, without trying and without apology. She was perhaps 65, small, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and an expression of absolute domestic competence that reminded me, in a way that hit somewhere specific in my chest, of Sandra. Not in her face, in her manner. The manner of a woman who had decided how things would be done and had been correct, often enough that she no longer felt the need to explain herself. She showed me the room. Simple, clean, a ceiling fan, a window looking onto a small garden with a papaya tree that I would later learn produced abundantly and was considered common property of the household. She told me meals were at 7 and 12 and 6, and that if I needed something between meals I should say so, and not go hungry out of politeness. Then she looked at me for a moment, in the particular way that people look at you when they are actually seeing you, and said, "You look tired, not from the travel, the other kind of tired." I said yes. She said, "Eat something, sleep, tomorrow is soon enough." She left me to it, and I sat in that small, clean room, on the far side of the world, from the house where Sandra had died, and I felt, for the first time in 11 months, something that was not grief, or fear, or the low hum of financial anxiety. I felt held, not fixed, not healed, just held, the way a room holds you when the temperature is right, and there is no demand being placed on your next thought. I cried. I want to be honest about that. I cried in that room the way I hadn't let myself cry since the kitchen floor with the recipe card. Properly. The way you can when you are finally somewhere far enough from everything that was witnessing your composure. Then I slept 9 hours. And in the morning there was a papaya from the tree already cut and waiting at my place at the table. And Ate Cora was talking to someone in Cebuano in the kitchen. And the sound of it, that language I couldn't understand a syllable of, was somehow the most comforting thing I had heard in almost a year. Let me tell you about the first weeks honestly, because I made real errors. And the errors are part of the story. The first error was assuming that friendly meant available. The people there are genuinely warm, in a way that took some adjusting to, from a man who grew up in a culture where warmth is rationed and strangers keep a measured distance. People would talk to me everywhere. At the market, at the little coffee shops along the boulevard, at the tricycle stand where I waited each morning for my ride into town. And I, in my loneliness, confused this openness with an invitation to unload. I told too much too fast to people who were being kind, who were being welcoming, who were not necessarily equipped or inclined to receive the full weight of a 70-year-old American's grief and financial ruin over a 10-minute acquaintance. I learned to hold some of it, not all of it, just enough. The culture there has a concept they call haya, something like shame but more like social awareness, a sensitivity to burdening other people that is actually a form of respect for their dignity and yours. You learn it by getting it wrong, and watching the slight discomfort on someone's face when you've crossed a line you didn't know was there. And then you learn where the line is. The second error was the food, which sounds small and was briefly serious. I ate with the enthusiasm of a man who had not been enthusiastic about much and who was now confronted with things he had never tasted and which were extraordinary. I ate everything. Sinuglaw, raw fish cured in coconut vinegar with ginger and chili. Inasal, chicken grilled over coconut husks, with a marinade that does things I do not have the vocabulary for. Kinilaw na tanige, the local fish prepared the same way, sharp and clean and perfect. I ate without restraint, and my stomach, at 70, reminded me with some firmness that restraint is not optional. 3 days of profound regret. Then I learned to pace myself, and everything was fine. But I want to include this because stories that omit the digestive incidents are sanitizing the experience. The thing that made me stop thinking about leaving, because I will tell you honestly I thought about it in those first 2 weeks, was a typhoon. Not a large one. By their standards, barely an event. By mine, a revelation. It came on a Thursday, the kind of rain that makes the corrugated roofs of that city sound like drums. The kind of wind that moves the palms in a sideways direction you don't expect from a palm tree. I was in my room. The power went. And within 20 minutes, every person in that small pension was in Ate Cora's kitchen. She had not organized it. Nobody organized it. There was a young couple from Manila on holiday. A German man who was researching something he hadn't explained. A local family visiting relatives who had spilled over from a full house next door. And me. And Ate Cora cooked. She cooked with the efficiency of a woman who had weathered many typhoons in that kitchen and had never once considered that a typhoon was a reason to do anything other than feed people. She made chicken adobo, which is the dish I believe was invented to demonstrate that simple is not the same as ordinary. Chicken braised in vinegar and garlic and soy sauce, until the sauce goes dark and the meat goes tender, and your entire body relaxes in a way you hadn't realized it needed to. She made rice. She made sinabawang gulay, a broth with whatever vegetables were at hand, and it was the most domestic sound I had heard in a year, the sound of a pot coming to simmer while a storm moved outside. We ate in her kitchen, all of us around a table that was technically too small for the number of people at it, and the German man who hadn't explained himself turned out to be studying indigenous weaving patterns and had strong opinions about it. And the young Manila couple had gotten engaged 3 days ago and were still in the luminous days of that. And Ate Cora's sister had come from 2 doors down to wait out the storm, and she and Ate Cora moved around each other in the kitchen in the way that people move who have been in each other's physical space for 60 years, without looking, without speaking, by memory and by love. And I was at the table. I was in it. Nobody was performing inclusion for the benefit of the elderly American. There just happened to be room at the table, and I happened to be in the house, and the storm happened to be outside. And Ate Cora happened to have made enough food, which she always did, because she had learned from her mother, who had learned from hers, that enough food is the first form of hospitality, and the last one you ever regret. At one point she put a plate in front of me without asking and said, "You are not eating enough. I can see it." She was right. I had been not eating enough for 11 months. I ate everything on the plate. And then, in the way of that kitchen, more appeared. I moved into a proper apartment at the end of that first month. The boulevard, the long seawall I had seen from the air, runs along the coast with the mountains behind the city and the Visayan Sea going flat and blue in front of it. And in the evenings the whole city walks there, slow circuits in the cooling air, families, old couples, students, vendors with carts of green mango with shrimp paste, kids on bicycles performing stunts that made my heart rate briefly medical. I had found a place one street back from the boulevard, on the ground floor of a small concrete building, with a little covered porch facing the interior courtyard. 8,000 pesos a month. Call it $140. 2 rooms, the porch, a kitchen small enough that everything was within reach, which at 70, with a hip that has opinions, is actually a feature. The building had 4 units. Above me, a young woman named Carla, who was finishing her nursing degree and who studied on her balcony at hours that suggested she did not recognize the concept of sleep. Beside her, a family, the Nacionals, husband and wife, and a boy of about 8 named Nico, who almost immediately decided that the old foreigner on the ground floor was a source of interest and took to appearing at my screen door at random intervals to report on events he considered significant: a dog incident, a fish he had caught with his father, a score in a game I didn't follow, but which he explained to me with the patience of someone teaching an advanced subject to a willing but limited student. And across the courtyard, in the unit facing mine, a man named Mang Eddie. Mang Eddie was 74, a retired fisherman. He had fished the waters around Negros Island for 50 years, and had the hands to prove it. His wife had died 6 years before I arrived. He had a son in Cebu who called reliably, and a daughter who lived 10 minutes away, and came twice a week and brought him food in containers that she stacked in his small refrigerator, with a labeling system that she had clearly instituted and that he had clearly never once consulted. He was wiry, almost entirely silent until he decided to speak, and when he spoke it was in Cebuano that I could not yet follow, translated by Nico when Nico was available, or by the gestural language that develops between 2 people who are patient with each other across a language barrier. We were both men who had lost the person who made our homes into homes. We recognized this in each other without naming it, the way you recognize a thing that is also true of you, by the particular way someone holds themselves around the absence. We started having coffee together in the mornings. He made it in a small pot in the Filipino style, dark and sweet, and I would cross the courtyard with my cup, and we would sit in the chairs he kept outside his door and watch the morning come into the courtyard. He told me things slowly, over weeks, in the patchwork way of our communication, about the sea, about specific fish and how they moved in specific seasons, about his wife, whose name was Nena, which he said once in the first month, not surrounded by anything, just said it as a fact he wanted to place in the air between us, and then was quiet for a moment, and then continued about something else. I told him about Sandra the same way. One morning, her name, a moment, then the birds in the courtyard going on about their business.